Donald Trump is probably the first American president since World War II who does not viscerally understand that the strength of American allies contributes to American strength. So when he starts threatening tariff wars immediately, he only sees our relationship with the Europeans in a zero-sum, with our allies in a zero-sum relationship. But trying to have good relations with Trump in the short term are probably necessary above all because of this big question of Ukraine. We don't know what the Trump administration is going to do about Ukraine. Gratuitously pissing him off might not be a very good idea.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Dr. Dana Allin, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
My pleasure.
Over the weekend, Donald Trump has, to put it lightly, ruffled feathers. Most notably, he suggested that Gaza was a demolition site and that we have to clean out that whole thing. And he called on Egypt and Jordan to take in Palestinians from Gaza. What did you make of that?
Well, it's pretty disturbing. It's aligning the United States effectively with the aspirations of the Israeli far right, which is effectively to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. As I say, it's a huge departure from U.S. policy going back to the founding of Israel, where the United States has not done it very effectively, and the Biden administration was not very effective in pushing Israel towards its preferred policies vis-a-vis this war. But to actively endorse ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza is quite far outside of the norm.
We obviously have this Israel-Gaza ceasefire deal at the moment, which Trump has claimed is partly from his doing. But how do you think this indicates how the US might be involved in this period moving forward with relations between Israel and Gaza?
The biggest sign we have so far is his statement over the weekend, suggesting that the Palestinians should leave, that Jordan and that Egypt should take them. I suppose if I were try to look at the most hopeful scenario, which is not particularly hopeful, Trump in his first term and actually between terms has had very good relations with the leader of Saudi Arabia and other Arab leaders. And if they effectively get their act together and try to put pressure on the United States to support movement towards a Palestinian state, they might have some leverage here. So that, to me, is the most hopeful scenario. I'm not saying it looks very bright. Part of the problem is you have the eccentricities of Mr. Trump himself. You also have, and I don't want to say anything definitively because you don't know exactly how the administration's sort of constellation of power is going to work, of influence is going to work out. But you have some people in the Republican Party and in the administration who have long been allied with the kind of greater Israel view of how to deal with the Palestinians, which is the idea that the occupied territories really belong to this greater Israel for biblical reasons and so forth. So I would say what the president said over the weekend vis-a-vis Gaza is very dispiriting.
And am they interested in this language that Trump is using? You could draw parallels with the way that he's talking about the Panama Canal, taking it back, and also Greenland. And even if Trump doesn't act on what he's saying, what do you make of that approach and that language he's using? And what does this indicate about Trump's approach to foreign policy moving forward?
Honestly, it's the language of a bully. I would, there has been a debate and a reasonable debate about how seriously to take some of these more outlandish statements, because to a pretty considerable extent, you can say that part of President Trump's technique is to throw out sort of decoys. I mean, a kind of, how shall I put it, a verbal shock and awe. So people are continuously reacting to what he says and being thrown off balance. But having said that, I mean, I don't think the United States is going to use military force to seize Greenland or the Panama Canal, etc. But having said that, he's already shown himself quite willing to use punitive tariffs to bend countries to his will, as he did over the weekend vis-a-vis Colombia.
As you mentioned, this shock and awe approach, some are calling it shock and awful. Where do you stand on that? Would you agree with the first or the latter?
Shock and awe versus shock and awful. I think it's pretty awful, if that's the question, and it's detrimental to the long-term interests of the United States.
So I want to hear your thoughts on Trump's threat to impose high tariffs and further sanctions on Russia if Putin doesn't end the war in Ukraine. When I spoke to Professor Scott Lucas last week, he told me that the Kremlin had been caught unaware by this and that Zelensky was playing a blinder on currying Trump's favor. What would be your take on that?
I mean, one of the things that people like Zelensky and America's European allies have been very worried about is Donald Trump's apparent affinity, self-expressed affinity for Putin. And, he obviously during the campaign, he said he would end the war in one day and pretty clearly intimated that he thought he could do so by cutting off aid to Ukraine. Now, I don't know that the United States has much effectively it can do through a coercive economic coercion against Russia that it hasn't already done. That's the first thing to say. But, there was always the possibility that unless Putin was ready to deal, to negotiate, that the president could be unpredictable. And he didn't, he would not necessarily want to seem like an easy pushover by the Russians. I think we just have to see what's going to happen. I have no idea, to be honest, exactly what the next steps are going to be from President Trump. But I think that he will. One thing he's been very clear about is that he wants to have a meeting with Putin, and he wants to start negotiations. And I think the ball is kind of in Putin's court as far as that goes. Whether Putin sees it as a good opportunity to lock in a deal that would probably be quite favorable to Russia, that's a possibility. On the other hand, President Putin has not changed his war aims, which are essentially the annihilation of Ukraine as a state.
And in his address to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump said he could try to bring down the cost of oil because if the price came down, the Russia-Ukraine war would end immediately. He's potentially reaching out to Saudi Arabia about this. Do you think that could end the war immediately? Do you think it would have any impact?
No, I certainly don't think it would end. That by itself would end the war immediately. Trump is onto something historically. Let's be clear. It's the high oil and energy prices that have always sustained Russia. And in fact, it was arguably a collapse in the oil price in the 1980s that had something to do with, that's a complicated story. It had something to do with the demise of the Soviet Union. So yes, there is historically a point here. But first of all, I don't know if Saudi is really going to be that interested in very cheap global oil prices. And I'm not sure how, I'm not an oil market expert, but one of the things that I know Trump has spoken about in the past is how the United States is going to help bring this about by pumping more oil and gas and so forth itself. That's not something you can do very quickly. The United States is already producing at a pretty high level. So yes, in theory, but in practice, I don't think that's going to be what's going to bring the Russians to see things necessarily from Trump's perspective. And, I mean, it has to be said, the Russians have proven more resilient and adaptable to U.S. and Western sanctions than I think many in the West had hoped initially.
And the big question is, what will this ceasefire deal potentially involve? Will Ukraine have to take concessions? But then on the other hand, do you think this will fully deter Putin? And also, what position would this leave Europe in? What do you think is the best case scenario for Ukraine and Europe? And do you see Trump aligning with that?
Well, first of all, I think we should be very cautious about, assuming that a ceasefire, an armistice, much less a peace agreement, is in the offing. That's very, very, very uncertain at this point. And as I suggested, I think there's not really much sign from Vladimir Putin that he's interested. But assuming that there could be some sort of deal, I mean, I don't think the United States is likely to hold out for much beyond what J.D. Vance spoke about during the campaign. I mean, possibly the most explicit thing you heard from the Trump team was a podcast interview that Vance gave, where he suggested, basically current lines of control between the two sides, an agreement not to an agreement that Ukraine would not be in NATO. I mean, I've heard from some Trump people that maybe this would be a time-limited agreement, something along those lines. But I think the most important part of your question is, what could Europe and the United States, what could Europe do to make that the strongest possible deal from the perspective of European security? Well, they want to give Ukraine sufficient security guarantees that the Russians don't really just start again once they've rested and remobilized. That's a very hard, that's a tall bill. I mean, it's a difficult thing to organize, but it means continuing to supply the Ukrainian military forces, really ramping up production on the European side of munitions, including artillery shells, and really being ready for the next possible round in the war. And this is absolutely critical to European security, because if the Russians really do succeed in destroying Ukraine, the depredations that could be inflicted upon European members of NATO, not to mention even potential invasion, just can't be ruled out. One big question, which I don't claim to have a good answer to, is what should Europeans do? There is a short-term impulse towards appeasement of Trump, and I use that word advisedly. And appeasement isn't always wrong. I mean, when Keir Starmer or David Lammy say nice things about Trump, I think that's probably kind of their duty as leaders of a country that can be punished by Trump. But when that becomes a way of allowing Trump to divide the Europeans, in my view, Brexit already divided the Europeans, something that Trump was very much in favor of. But if the Europeans take appeasement to the extent, or pursue appeasement to the extent of really falling out among each other and sort of competing with each other, I think that could be very dangerous for Europe. But trying to have good relations with Trump in the short term are probably necessary, above all because of this big question of Ukraine. We don't know what the Trump administration is going to do about Ukraine. And gratuitously pissing him off might not be a very good idea.
Trump is notably anti-war, and he has expressed in the past his lack of desire for American money and support to go to Ukraine. How much of this ceasefire deal is Trump trying to wash his hands of the US's involvement in Ukraine?
A strong view among, let's call it, MAGA Republicans that we've spent too much on, well, the United States has spent too much on Ukraine. The Europeans have not spent enough. I mean, it depends on your view, perspective here, but from a simple point of view, it's not really true. The Europeans have spent about as much as the United States has spent, and have given, have sacrificed more in certain other areas, such as taking in refugees, the pain to the European economies because of increased gas prices and so forth. But I may be losing a little bit sight of the question. The question is
this Trump sort of washing the US's hands of involvement?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I can't predict the future, but the signs have been there for a long time that's what Trump, and I referred to MAGA, the MAGA movement, which has been, positively hostile to Ukraine. And in fact, certain parts of right-wing MAGA have been actually very pro-Putin, very pro-Russian. Now, that's not the whole Republican Party. That's not the United States, the Republican majority in the United States Senate, certainly not the majority of Republicans. It's not administration officials like Secretary, well, I don't know if he's been confirmed yet, but soon to be confirmed, or he has been confirmed, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's an old line Atlanticist Republican. So how that all falls out, I am not entirely sure, but there is a strong impulse to, as you say, wash American hands of the Ukraine problem. And I fear that over the long haul, that could win out, unfortunately.
So the America First approach that Trump is taking, how do you see that impacting Trump's relationship with allies, not just in NATO, but allies in the West, with these approaches that he's taking?
Donald Trump is probably the first American president since World War II who does not viscerally understand that the strength of American allies contributes to American strength. So when he starts threatening tariff wars immediately, he only sees our relationship with the Europeans in a zero-sum, with our allies in a zero-sum relationship. Now, some people, the kindest word that is very often used about this is transactional. And yes, transactionally, maybe things can, maybe alliances can be stabilized on a more transactional and less sentimental and less values-based footing. But the problem is, as I say, he actually seems to want to damage the allies. The whole tariffs policy or the tariffs threats is, potentially quite devastating to our allies. Now, how this plays out, I think you asked about allies beyond Europe. How this plays out in the Asia-Pacific region with allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, all of that, that's kind of hard to say. But I will say that these allies, including, for example, successive prime ministers of Japan, have argued strongly that support for Ukraine and Ukraine's defense is important for security also in East Asia, because they're afraid that China will take will take an unfortunate lesson from the possibility of Ukraine being defeated vis-a-vis its ambitions on Taiwan.
If we looked at that from a defense and security perspective for America, if these tariffs were imposed, how can Trump expect NATO allies in the EU to boost their own defense spending as he requests, but also that relationship between these EU, NATO allies and America? They'll be weakened. But I was interested in something you wrote. You wrote about how the economic strength of Europe is no longer a vital American interest. On the contrary, an economically strong Europe is bad for the United States. Could you elaborate on that point?
Well, and let me be absolutely clear. I did write that, but I was writing that that is the view of Donald Trump. That is certainly not my view. My view, and I think the view of American leadership going all the way back to World War II, is that Europe's economic strength is very important to the United States. I mean, to begin with, for the reason you alluded to, because they do need to raise defense spending. I mean, I'd say one good thing that Trump has accomplished in what we now have to call the Trump era, starting in 2015 or 2016, is he did help encourage the Europeans to think more seriously about their own defense. But, going back to, I mean, I think in the piece that you were referring to that I wrote, I was going back all the way to the immediate post-World War II era and the early Cold War, where it actually was an American goal to build up European economies and societies with the view that a successful Europe would act as not just a military, but maybe more importantly, a political barrier to Soviet expansion and to communist success. That's what I think President Trump doesn't understand. And, it's a complete contradiction to suggest that you damage these countries economically and then expect them to be able to take care of themselves. Now, the other dimension of it is, of course, solidarity between the United States and Europe, having Europe have the view that the United States is a good ally, and the political consequences of making enemies of the Europeans. There was a very, very interesting poll out, and I'm sorry, I can't remember. It may have been the Pew poll. No, I think it was the European Council on Foreign Relations that found that actually Trump's election through much of the world is not actually that unpopular, or Trump isn't that unpopular. He's very unpopular in Europe, and that's not good for U.S.-European relations.
Trump is considering a 10% tariff on China from as soon as February. This is much lower than his previously mentioned 60%. But last time tariffs were imposed on China, some suggest that this pushed China and Mexico closer together on trade and foreign investment. And China is now Mexico's second largest trading partner after the United States. Some have interpreted this as a soft power move from China. Do you think that Trump's concerned about that?
Well, to the second part of the question, President Trump does not behave as though he's aware of the risk of pushing, troubled but friendly countries like Mexico closer to the Chinese. I mean, the threat that he expressed astonishingly in his inaugural address, that we will take Panama back. He claimed it's run by China. Take the Panama Canal back, claiming that it's being operated by China. Well, it's not being operated by China. But it is true that China has made considerable inroads into Latin America generally in terms of economy and what you referred to as soft power. Reviving the memories of an imperialistic sort of predatory Yankee predator is not going to be great for political influence in Latin America, and particularly not Mexico being a big case. I mean, of course, you have to combine that with the stated determination to organize mass deportations of something like 11 million. They claim it's more, but I think arguably it's something like 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. if the United States really did this, depriving, I mean, not only would it be very economically very bad for the United States, but it would be devastating for countries like Mexico that depend for a significant amount of their income on remittances from workers in the United States. So, yeah, to the broader point, I don't think there is a serious geoeconomic statecraft in these American policies, because it's not looking beyond the first step of coercion and punishment and bullying of economic partners.
Dana, Allin, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
My pleasure. Thank you.